faithfully delivering value and exploring great books from around the world. Hi, this is Sally Book Talk. Today, I'm discussing the book title, The Glory and the Dream. From 1932 to 1972, William Manchester, an American narrative historian, was a renowned journalist and historian. He was also a close friend of former President Kennedy, writing many speeches for him. As the title suggests, this book covers American history from 1932 to 1972. You might wonder, why did the author pick this specific era? Because it was incredibly important for the United States. The U.S. transformed from a struggling nation on the brink to a dominant superpower, and that foundation was laid over these 40 years. In short, by understanding these 4 decades, you grasp the secret behind America's rise. Though 40 years may not seem long, explaining it thoroughly isn't an easy task. First, during these years, America faced major events like the Great Depression, Roosevelt's New Deal, World War II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and many more. Moreover, as time passed, U.S. politics grew more influential globally, and the decisions became increasingly complex. It's a tall order for any author to clearly spell out all the details and backgrounds. Luckily, William Manchester, with his journalistic skills and storytelling knack, pulled it off. The Glory and the Dream has become the go-to book for understanding modern America. Plus, the book's approach is unique. The author focuses on historical news events, making the content rich and the reading thrilling. For example, at the start, the author describes a group of veterans who served in World War I. After the Great Depression hit, they feared losing their pensions and marched to Washington to camp out, demanding early payment. Nearly 20,000 soldiers were dejected and exhausted. Sympathetic folks donated money and brought them bread and pies. But President Hoover was indecisive and sent troops to suppress them, resulting in 4 deaths and over 100 injuries. This is the infamous Washington Massacre of 1932. The crackdown was led by Army Chief of Staff MacArthur, with his aide Eisenhower relaying orders. At the forefront was Patton. This incident was the biggest stain on Hoover's presidency, painting him as heartless and ending his re-election hopes. History thus chose Roosevelt and his New Deal. The book contains many such examples that transport readers back to pivotal moments, evoking Americans' collective memory. These vivid accounts make The Glory and the Dream an exceptionally thick volume, yet immerse you completely while reading. Next, I'll guide you through this book. Given its massive length, the Chinese edition divides it chronologically into 4 volumes, so I'll cover it in 4 sessions accordingly. Today we'll focus on the first volume, spanning 1932 to 1941. This decade covers the peak of America's Great Depression, up until the Pearl Harbor attack. Central to this period was Roosevelt's election, his New Deal launch, and his active response to fascist threats. All right, let's turn our gaze to 1932 America, a presidential election year marked by fierce candidate competition, including Franklin D. Roosevelt. With hindsight, we know Roosevelt emerged victorious, not only winning the presidency, but serving an unprecedented 4 terms. Roosevelt is now highly regarded alongside Washington and Lincoln, though this perspective comes with historical distance. But returning to that moment, you'd find Roosevelt's victory was far from assured. Simply put, his political stance was unconventional and unpopular with elites. American elites then staunchly believed in laissez-faire economics, viewing minimal government intervention as ideal. They argued that during economic crises, restraint would allow markets to self-correct and restore prosperity. This theory gained unanimous endorsement from politicians, tycoons, and media moguls. Logically, Roosevelt should have been one of them. Born in 1882 to wealth Roosevelt attended elite schools like Groton before studying history and politics at Harvard. His father left him $120,000, a fortune then, while his mother inherited $1.3 million in family assets. Moreover, his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, a prominent Republican, became president in 1901 and was widely adored. From childhood, Roosevelt enjoyed privileges beyond most Americans' reach. The only setback struck at 39. That year, he contracted poliomyelitis, commonly called polio, which left him permanently disabled. He had to walk using crutches in a wheelchair. Despite his own melancholy life, Roosevelt didn't react with indifference to ordinary people's struggles like many wealthy did. He was deeply empathetic, able to truly feel others' pain. So when entering politics, he chose the Democratic Party over his cousins, Republicans. Among America's two major parties, relatively speaking, Republicans favored the wealthy while Democrats leaned toward the disadvantaged. By joining Democrats, Roosevelt clearly declared his political stance. In early 1929, Roosevelt became New York governor. Soon, the Great Depression hit, and as the financial hub, New York suffered first. He implemented measures like job creation for the unemployed, relief payments, and public works projects. In short, he consistently worked to overcome the economic crisis. This approach was deeply unpopular in political circles. As mentioned, laissez-faire economics dominated America then, prohibiting government intervention. President Hoover strictly followed this doctrine. In late October 1929, the New York stock market crashed, triggering a chain reaction. It plunged the entire U.S. economy to rock bottom, marking the Great Depression's start. Facing this crisis, how did Hoover respond? Two words: inaction. For 3 full years, Hoover never left Washington. He refused to see reality and took no action, not due to personal flaws, but because it was standard political practice. State governments did the same. By contrast, Roosevelt's New York measures seemed highly unconventional. So when he ran for president, almost no one supported him. In Democratic primaries, Roosevelt nearly got eliminated. No one expected this unconventional candidate would ultimately win the nomination. So how did Roosevelt achieve this comeback? According to the author, it can be explained through social circumstances and personal traits. First, the social situation. By 1932, the U.S. economy neared collapse. After dozens of stock crashes, the Dow Jones plunged from 470 to 40 points. Factories closed, businesses failed, countless lost jobs. National unemployment peaked at 17 million. Most were family breadwinners, including children and the elderly. 34 million urban residents had no income, 28% of America's population. Additionally, 11 million farmers struggled on the brink of death. It's fair to say across America, from cities to villages, people starved. How bad was it? City dwellers abandoned dignity to scavenge trash bins, gnawing bones and rinds. Even maggot-infested rot became a feast. Farmers fared worse, eating weeds, violets, dandelions. This meant tens of millions of families faced ruin, with middle-class collapse being especially alarming. After WWI, European nations grappled with severe internal crises. Germany, Italy, Spain, even France and Britain faced unrest. By contrast, America remained stable, largely thanks to its millions-strong middle class. The middle class worked diligently, earned modest livings, embraced stability, and rejected radical change. Truly, middle-class families formed the bedrock of America's social stability. Americans had long prided themselves as a middle-class nation, until the Depression destroyed it. Unemployment stripped the middle class of their livelihoods. Worse, many had invested savings in stocks during the boom. When markets crashed, they lost everything. Office workers, engineers, principals, farmers, even famous authors and future Nobel laureates faced food insecurity. Take John Steinbeck, a laborer turned reporter whose novels gained acclaim starting in 1929. Yet Steinbeck teetered near starvation. He used lard, ash, and salt as laundry soap when he couldn't afford real soap. His teeth decayed beyond repair, falling out untreated. Eventually, he couldn't afford manuscript postage. His books only published through his agent's charity. Tens of millions unemployed spawned social crises. Homelessness surged first. By 1932, about 2 million wandered America. Among them, workers, farmers, clerks, students. Even Steinbeck joined these drifting masses. Later, drawing from this experience, he created classic novels like Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath, winning the 1962 Nobel Prize in Literature. The economy collapsed. Society was out of control. Hoover was helpless. And by 1932, the federal deficit hit $4 billion, nearly collapsing. Hoover, however, still pinned his hopes on the market's self-regulation. But the people had lost faith. They felt that if this continued, America was doomed and change was essential. Roosevelt seized the moment to propose the New Deal. Roosevelt argued that the Great Depression was an unprecedented disaster, so the government must implement unprecedented policies to turn the tide. That's the New Deal. The New Deal included providing social relief, building public works, strengthening financial regulation, and more. These measures could improve ordinary folks' lives, create jobs, boost market confidence, and overcome the Depression. Of course, doing this required a massive expansion of federal government power. Roosevelt's New Deal met people's hopes. Though its details were complex and hard for average folks to grasp, they knew he was willing to change and bring hope. That was enough to earn their support. This scene resembled later Obama, who ran during the peak of the subprime crisis with change as his slogan, and Hillary also resonated with struggling Americans. Of course, during the campaign, Roosevelt's personal qualities also played a crucial role. Like all great politicians, Roosevelt possessed traits like passion, sincerity, and resolve. In speeches, his messages were clear, relatable, and highly engaging. In contrast, Hoover moved in elite circles and was detached from ordinary people's lives and minds. He lacked sympathy for the underprivileged. During the Depression's worst phase, Hoover still lived a lavish life. He wore expensive suits, smoked handmade Havana cigars, rode in luxury cars, and had 7-course dinners. He even deceived himself by telling the media that few were starving, the homeless weren't an issue, and they ate better than before. Compared to Hoover's coldness, Roosevelt was far more approachable. Voters' preference was obvious. In December 1932, Roosevelt won overwhelmingly, with 472 votes to Hoover's 59, becoming the 32nd U.S. president. In March 1933, Hoover left office, Roosevelt entered the White House, and the New Deal began. Roosevelt inherited a mess, especially the financial sector, that seemed endlessly collapsing. From the stock crash to 1933, over 5,000 banks failed nationwide, and the situation worsened. Just before Roosevelt's inauguration, Michigan State Bank collapsed, spreading panic nationwide. People rushed to withdraw money, forming long queues at banks across American cities, an unprecedented sight. Many arrived before dawn, fearing they couldn't access their savings. Daily withdrawals reached $37 million in gold and over $100 million in cash during that period. Even Bank of America, then the world's largest private savings bank, neared collapse. To avoid failure, it suspended operations. Others immediately followed. The result was all U.S. banks closed. The NYSE shut for the first time in 85 years. Financial collapse loomed. So the priority became quelling the bank runs. Under Roosevelt's push, Congress swiftly passed the Glass Act. It mandated that those who withdrew gold after February 1st, 1933, must redeposit it by deadline or face penalties. and this produced immediate results. Within a week, the Federal Reserve recovered $300 million in gold and gold certificates. As panic subsided, 75% of banks reopened. The NYC resumed trading with stocks rising 15%, a first victory. Roosevelt won hearts, but the depression persisted, and challenges remained severe. With the immediate crisis resolved, Roosevelt prepared systematic New Deal implementation to overcome the depression. The newly passed Glass Act provided the perfect opportunity. The act required congressional approval for presidential and Treasury actions, freeing government hands, clearing obstacles for New Deal policies, a major step in expanding presidential power. Empowered by the Glass Act, Roosevelt's team urged Congress to pass 13 key bills, including the Emergency Banking Act and National Industrial Recovery Act. Accomplished in about 100 days, this period became known as the 100 Days. The 100 Days key measures included these three. First, investigation and reform. Strengthened regulation of financial markets on Wall Street. Wall Street is a Manhattan thoroughfare housing banks, funds, brokerages, institutions controlling America's financial system. Wall Street financiers bore responsibility for the Great Depression. After taking office, Roosevelt launched a Wall Street investigation. Investigators found that Wall Street speculation inflated stocks beyond real economic value until the bubble burst, triggering chain reactions. Economic crisis swept the nation. Outrageously, Wall Street anticipated this but hid warnings while profiting. For example, Chase Bank's Wigan colluded with hedge funds to inflate stocks, then dumped them before the crash for huge profits. Wall Street's actions sparked fury, shifting public opinion against financial laissez-faire. Roosevelt capitalized on this sentiment, enacting strict financial regulations through legislation. Key measures included banning savings banks and insurers from stock markets to protect customers, implemented deposit insurance for all banks to minimize savings risks, created the SEC to strictly prohibit insider trading. These policies tightly restrained Wall Street, stabilizing U.S. markets for decades. Second, providing social relief through public works projects. Immediately allocating $400 million in federal relief aided 2 million families during emergencies. He established the Works Progress Administration, investing heavily in infrastructure like water systems, schools, post offices, bridges, and stations. During the 100 days, 30,000 plus public projects created jobs for countless unemployed. Let's highlight the Tennessee Valley Project. The Tennessee Valley spans America's southeast across 100,000 square kilometers. Economically backward, it was among America's poorest regions, mostly without electricity. In 1933, the U.S. established the TVA, hiring unemployed workers to build dams, power plants, and develop shipping. After several years of construction, the Tennessee Valley became America's most important power generation base. During World War II, the development of the atomic bomb relied on the Tennessee Valley Project's steady power supply to complete smoothly. This can be said to be an unexpected benefit of the New Deal. Third, safeguarding workers' rights. Before Roosevelt took office, workers faced intense labor. 12-hour shifts were common, yet wages were generally very low. General Motors executives earned an average annual salary of $200,000, while workers toiled all year for just $1,000. After the Great Depression hit, tens of millions of unemployed scrambled for jobs, and with child labor permitted, workers' conditions worsened further. At that time, employers used brutal tactics against workers demanding rights. Firing, abuse, beatings were routine. Killing protesters wasn't rare, making labor relations extremely tense. After the New Deal began, the government enacted laws to protect workers' basic rights. The laws also mandated that in labor disputes, Workers had collective bargaining rights with government intervention. Employers couldn't use violence, ending employer dominance. It can be said that these three measures under Roosevelt were vital for rescuing the economy and restoring social order. They were tangible forces. On the other hand, an intangible force also played an irreplaceable role: Roosevelt's personal charisma. Before Roosevelt, U.S. presidents followed an elite path, aloof and detached from the public. Roosevelt broke norms by communicating directly with people, achieving great results, most famously through his fireside chats. At that time, radio was an emerging medium gaining popularity. Nearly every household had a radio and listened daily. Roosevelt realized this was the best channel to dialogue with the public. And on his 8th day as president, he accepted a radio company's invitation for a recorded interview. Since the interview was by the fireplace in the White House reception room, it became known as a fireside chat. Roosevelt abandoned bureaucratic language entirely, speaking to listeners in warm, familiar terms. For example, in the second fireside chat, Roosevelt opened by saying he wasn't there to lecture, but to report on how the federal government planned to tackle the economic crisis. Then he explained his policies in language everyone could understand. Finally, Roosevelt expressed gratitude to his supporters and praised their resilience. This approachable stance made the fireside chats highly effective. After each broadcast, Roosevelt received hundreds of thousands of letters. People were deeply moved. During his presidency, Roosevelt delivered over 20 fireside chats. At every critical juncture for America's fate, the public could hear the president's warm, firm, and charismatic voice on the radio. It can be said that the fireside chats accompanied Americans through overcoming the Great Depression, recovering from Pearl Harbor's shock, and gradually propelling national fortunes to their peak. The 100 Days achieved tremendous success. By the fourth month of Roosevelt's presidency, financial markets stabilized. The industrial production index rose from 59 to 100. Agricultural prices recovered. Workers' and farmers' lives improved. The middle class regained vitality. Historians widely agree the Great Depression essentially ended by July 1933, lasting nearly 4 years since October 1929. The New Deal ended it. Roosevelt's prestige soared to its zenith. In 1936, he was reelected. But real history isn't simple. The Depression's end didn't mean Roosevelt could rest easy. In reality, during his second term, he faced significant challenges. These difficulties divided into two parts, one caused by the New Deal itself. The other came from opposition. First, the New Deal's own issues. Simply put, the New Deal approach involved government funding for relief and investment, helpful for stability, but with side effects. For example, over 18 million relied on relief during the New Deal, with financially struggling states like Arkansas and Mississippi requiring federal coverage for 90% of relief funds. This meant the government had to continuously increase spending to prevent unemployment resurgence. The feared scenario still occurred. In October 1937, Roosevelt's second term's first year, the New York stock market crashed again, quickly impacting the real economy. By spring 1938, about 5 million were unemployed again. 14% survived on relief funds. Roosevelt immediately announced $3 billion in federal funding for public works projects. Public sentiment finally stabilized and the market gradually recovered. Although the crisis has passed, the solution is still the same old approach. People are starting to wonder if the New Deal has run out of tricks. If another crisis comes, can he still handle it? Subtle shifts in public sentiment made opponents feel that an opportunity had arrived. Opponents of the New Deal can be roughly divided into two groups. One group disagrees with Roosevelt's governing philosophy, for example, judges of the federal Supreme Court. The other group is interest groups who oppose fiercely because the New Deal harms their interests. First, let's look at the first group of opponents centered around the federal Supreme Court, obstructing the implementation of the New Deal. The federal Supreme Court has 9 justices, collectively called the Nine. 6 are conservatives who believe in laissez-faire and dislike Roosevelt. Among them, Chief Justice Hughes's views are typical. Hughes believed that the New Deal expanded government power, interfered with normal economic activities, and violated the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, although he agreed with some measures of the New Deal, he often ruled them unconstitutional and invalid. Under the leadership of conservative justices, the Supreme Court opposed Roosevelt almost everywhere. According to statistics, in the previous 140 years, the Supreme Court had invalidated a total of 60 laws. Yet in Roosevelt's first year in office, as many as 11 bills were overturned. What frustrated Roosevelt most was the National Industrial Recovery Act being ruled unconstitutional. The act was enacted in 1933. According to this act, the government had the authority to control and regulate industrial production to prevent overproduction from blind competition. The act also stipulated that workers and consumers had the right to supervise corporate production. If a company violated rules, the president could revoke its license. In 1935, the 9 justices of the federal Supreme Court ruled the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional by an 8-1 vote. The justices' reason was that the act harmed business owners' property rights and restricted corporate freedom, violating the fundamental spirit of the U.S. Constitution. Roosevelt was both angry and helpless about this. So, how should we view the Supreme Court stance today? The justices may have hindered the New Deal and prolonged the Great Depression. However, the American public understood and even supported their actions because the Supreme Court did prevent presidential abuse of power. A small story illustrates this well. Economist Hayek was a critic of the New Deal. In 1945, while visiting the U.S., he took a taxi where the car radio announced Roosevelt's death. Upon hearing this, the driver said, "Roosevelt was a good president, but he shouldn't have fought the Supreme Court." These words left Hayek deeply moved. If justices opposed Roosevelt to prevent power abuse, another group did so over interests. They were mainly composed of wealthy financiers and entrepreneurs. The rich opposed Roosevelt because the New Deal strengthened market regulation, improved workers' conditions, imposed high progressive taxes, and redistributed wealth, all harming their interests. So the wealthy used their media to launch smear campaigns against Roosevelt. Among them, Hearst was the most enthusiastic. Hearst was an American newspaper magnate who owned over 60 publications, 12 radio stations, wielding tremendous public influence. The Hollywood film Citizen Kane was based on him. As a wealthy man, Hearst hated the New Deal. Under his instigation, his media persistently attacked Roosevelt, peaking when Roosevelt sought re-election. Some claimed Roosevelt had venereal disease and would die soon. Others called him a traitor planning to surrender America to the Soviets. Rumors flew everywhere. Conservatives thought this would ruin Roosevelt, but it backfired. Because people personally experienced the New Deal's benefits, the more conservatives smeared Roosevelt, the more the public disliked them. This actually boosted Roosevelt's support. Before the 1936 election, mainstream polls showed extremely low support for Roosevelt. The Republican candidate Landon seemed likely to win, but election results stunned conservatives. Roosevelt won overwhelmingly with 523 votes to Landon's 8. Post-analysis revealed about 5 million Republican supporters voted for Democrat Roosevelt, showing clear public will. Though conservatives failed to stop Roosevelt's re-election, they troubled him greatly on another matter: foreign policy. After WWN, Europe remained unstable with societies in turmoil. In 1922, Mussolini became Italy's prime minister, marking fascism's rise. In 1933, Hitler became Germany's Führer, began rearming and remilitarized the Rhineland 3 years later. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War erupted, with Italy and Germany sending troops to intervene. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria. Simultaneously, they menacingly eyed Eastern European countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, while war clouds gathered over Europe. As for Asia, it was already engulfed in flames of war. In 1937, the full-scale Sino-Japanese War broke out, completely exposing Japan's ambition to dominate China. This seriously threatened British and American interests in China and worsened the international situation. How did Americans react? In short, they ignored it, thinking it didn't concern them. At that time, isolationism prevailed in the US. Both elites and ordinary people showed little interest in international affairs. Isolationists argued that America's participation in W1, sending young men to die in Europe, wasn't worth it, and such mistakes shouldn't be repeated. As for the Sino-Japanese War, Americans felt no connection and completely didn't want to get involved. Conservatives catered to public sentiment, repeatedly advocating that America should focus on its own affairs and avoid others' messy problems. Besides, America truly lacked the capacity to meddle in others' business. In the 1930s, America's total military force was merely 130,000, ranking 16th globally, even behind Turkey. Poland's military was roughly comparable to Yugoslavia's. Even among these 130,000 troops, most were clerical staff. The prestigious Army Chief of Staff, MacArthur, could only mobilize 30,000 combat-ready troops, and their weapons were inadequate. The Army had about 1,000 tanks and over 1,500 aircraft. All defective, no one could guarantee they'd hold up battle. Roosevelt was deeply troubled by this. As a statesman with global vision, he recognized early that fascism would threaten world peace and disrupt international order. America couldn't remain unscathed long term. If fascists conquered Europe and Asia, America's prosperity would end. But facing rampant isolationism, Roosevelt couldn't force the issue. What could he do? He had to find an opening, and he did. There were two openings: expanding the Navy and aiding Britain in its desperate plight. First, naval expansion. Here, Roosevelt played cleverly. He told Congress, stay out of others' business is right, but even isolation requires strong defenses. How else can we resist attackers? The U.S. has oceans on both sides. Only a strong Navy could ensure security. Congress was persuaded to approve $1 billion to establish the Pacific and Atlantic fleets. History proved this move was exceptionally strategic. In World War II, it was precisely this robust foundation that allowed the U.S. Navy to rebound quickly after Pearl Harbor and become a naval power. Now let's examine America's assistance to wartime Britain. In September 1939, Nazi Germany blitzed Poland. Britain and France declared war, officially starting World War II. German forces occupied Poland in just over a month. In April 1940, Germany launched its Western Front campaign. Norway, Netherlands, and Belgium surrendered successively. By June, Paris fell, France surrendered, and suddenly Britain stood alone against the onslaught. In July 1940, the German Luftwaffe began massive bombing raids on Britain. The Battle of Britain commenced, while Americans watched detachedly from across the ocean. Yet, when Britain truly faced collapse, Americans were finally shaken. Culturally and ethnically, Americans shared deep roots with the British, creating natural affinity. With Britain's survival at stake, Americans couldn't help but feel concern. Here, the media's role became crucial. Frontline reports and photos revealed the Luftwaffe dropped 4.4 million pounds of bombs on London in just one night. London was devastated beyond recognition. Thousands of civilians perished. Countless were homeless. This struck deep emotional chords in America. American isolationism began to waver. Most Americans felt they should at least aid Britain without joining the war. Roosevelt seized this opening. Fuck you. He urged Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act. Through it, Roosevelt supplied Britain continuously, later extending aid to China and the Soviet Union, crucial support for anti-fascist efforts worldwide. The breakthrough was made. Americans now accepted aid, but not direct combat. Roosevelt needed one final catalyst. Unexpectedly, it came from Japan. In December 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, killing over 2,400 Americans. This treacherous, unprovoked assault enraged Americans. Instantly, isolationism vanished as war cries echoed nationwide. But the U.S. government immediately declared war on Japan, turning a new page in history. All right, that concludes the main content of the first volume. So, how does the author evaluate Roosevelt's performance after taking office in 1933? Overall, he holds a positive view of the New Deal with three main points. First, the New Deal led America out of the Great Depression, saving millions of middle-class families and pulling the nation back from the brink of collapse. This achievement cannot be overstated. Second, during the New Deal era, America established social security systems, significantly improved workers' conditions, and achieved unprecedented labor management harmony, all driven by Roosevelt. Third, Roosevelt was remarkably perceptive about shifting international dynamics. Without his proactive military preparations, America would have struggled to recover quickly after Japan's surprise attack. Additionally, the author doesn't hide the New Deal's negative legacy, primarily the expansion of presidential power, which threatened America's separation of powers. The author acknowledges Roosevelt believed overcoming the Depression required greater presidential authority. But once granted, power is hard to reclaim. Starting with Roosevelt, U.S. presidents gained unprecedented executive powers over diplomacy and war, unimaginable to predecessors. The problem is, while Roosevelt used these powers wisely, his successors might not. For example, President George W. Bush bypassed Congress when launching the Iraq War. The later evidence showed Bush's intelligence assessments were flawed, trapping America in a quagmire. This borders on abuse of war powers. It must be said Roosevelt opened this institutional loophole and bears some responsibility. Well, that completes Volume 1 of The Glory and the Dream. Reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.